The local history feature is brought to you by Gravity FM in association with Your Heritage, awarding funds from the National Lottery. See www.hlf.org.uk.
Grantham Poor Union was formed in January 1836. The first official recorded workhouse was on Workhouse Lane, SK 912352 in 1837 by S. Kemthorpe, and closed 1892. The site was sold to the Great North Railway and demolished. The second Grantham Workhouse was 119 Dysite Road and became a public assistance institute called Hillview Hospital from 1948. It was demolished in the 1960s. So to get a feeling of what a workhouse would have been like, Helen starts by visiting Southwell Workhouse, the most complete workhouse in existence. And then Helen talks to local historian and author Malcolm Knapp about the Grantham Workhouse.
Southwell Workhouse was the blueprint for all other workhouses throughout the country. It is the most complete and least altered example of a workhouse in existence. The workhouse is owned by the National Trust and is just a 30-minute drive from Grantham. I visited the workhouse and spoke to two ladies who work there, Jane Button, the property administrator, and Sam Ball, who is the visitor services assistant. Sam, how long have you worked here?
I volunteered here for 3 years, and this is my second season of working at the workhouse. I work on the front of house team, so we welcome visitors into the workhouse and also support them in the day room as well, which is our new refreshment services. But on my volunteer side, I work on the oral history team, and we focus on 20th century research.
Jane, when was this workhouse built?
The workhouse was built in 1824, and it was the brainchild of the Reverend Beecher, who was a local clergyman and social reformer. He'd already established a small workhouse in the town of Southwell itself and wanted to really develop that into a more economically viable model to cater for the needs, the ever-increasing needs of the poor. So the workhouse was actually built in 1824, and it was funded through the local parishes. Previously, individual parishes had a role in supporting the needs of the poor for their immediate area. But the Reverend Beecher's idea was that by combining the income from the different parishes, they could produce a more effective method of looking after the poor. And the poor really were those that came to the workhouse as a last resort. Perhaps local agricultural labourers who, during the slack season, found themselves out of work, unable to support their families, would come into the workhouse for a period of time and then go out again when there was work available. Others, like the old and infirm, although they came to the workhouse, were realistically fairly unlikely to ever leave it. If their families couldn't support them, this was really the place of last resort for them.
If you're an elderly person around that time and you hadn't got a family to look after you, what you're saying is the parish would fund you to come to the workhouse.
I mean, there was a system which involved relieving officers going to individual villages to assess the needs of the poor, and people could present themselves to relieving officers saying why they'd fallen upon hard times, they weren't able to look after themselves. And then it would be up to the relieving officer to make the case for that individual to come to the workhouse. And they would do that through an application to what was known as the Board of Guardians. Now, they were a group of people, one from each of eventually 60 parishes that were involved with the workhouse. And they were, if you like, the sort of the trustees of the workhouse. And they would ultimately make the decisions, informed also by the master, who was the paid member of staff running the workhouse, as to who would actually be admitted. So it was very much on a case-by-case basis. And although the workhouse was here to provide residential care, in effect, for the poor, both the elderly and working age poor, they also were able to provide out relief, so they could give forms of benefit to individuals still within their villages.
So if you were elderly and infirm, the term workhouse, were they still actually forced to work till you drop?
Well, its name is quite appropriate, really, but the old and infirm were treated more kindly. They didn't have as harsh a regime to follow in terms of the work, the daily routine, but they were expected, if they were still able, to make some sort of contribution towards the work of the workhouse. They also had a few perks over and above some of the other inmates, so they might have had a bit of tobacco or a bit of ale or something that the able-bodied or the undeserving poor, as they became known, were not entitled to. There was very much a distinction between the deserving poor, the old and infirm, and the undeserving poor, the sort of the idle and profligate, if you like, who were out of work for a whole variety of reasons.
Very strange, isn't it, to think of the undeserving, because I wouldn't think any person would actually want to end up in the workhouse.
No, I don't think people did want to end up in the workhouse, and it was a deterrent. I mean, it had to be an unpleasant place, and it was really only if people were at the end of their tether, they'd fallen on hard times, such that the workhouse actually presented a better place to be than staying in their own homes or within their villages. And whilst it was a harsh regime and hard work, it did offer at least a roof over their heads, 3 meals a day, education for their children, which would have been unheard of for the children in the villages. So that there were some elements to it which were really put in place to try and improve people's lot ultimately, particularly for the children, give them a much stronger chance of being able to break the cycle of poverty and get out and hopefully get a job, even if it was at as a servant in one of the big houses or as an agricultural labourer. They were one step up the ladder, if you like, compared to many of the children outside.
What age were they schooled from, Jane?
They were schooled from quite young until such a time as education came in. I think it was around the 1870s when they would actually go out to the local schools, and you can imagine, they were wearing their pauper uniforms, these kids going out to the local schools. There would have been a lot of stigma attached to that. You can imagine, how they might have felt. But the education that they got here was, 4 hours a day, something like that, and it would have been the basic, 3 hours. So they would have, had a bit of a head start.
And of course it was free as well. At that time, before the Education Act came in the 1870s, you had to pay for your education. Obviously in the workhouse here they were receiving an education which they may not have received if they were outside of the workhouse. When you came into the workhouse, your clothes were taken away from you, and you were given the workhouse uniform, which was a dress for the women with a pinafore, and the same but in a smaller version for the little ones, and the gentlemen would be in very rough material, very hard material of trousers and a shirt.
Do you know if there was anybody famous that came through the workhouse doors that made it out to go on to better things?
I suppose the most famous, not from Southwell Workhouse, but the most famous one who is always quoted is Charlie Chaplin.
Jane, what was the food like in the workhouse?
Well, it was certainly monotonous, and day in, day out pretty much the same thing. But it was plentiful. I mean, if you imagine the lunchtime portion of potatoes for a man would be at least £1. Now, £1 today would be a huge amount for any of us to eat. So it was quite starchy and quite bulky, but there was plenty of it, and because they cultivated the land here, the vegetables would have been grown and be fresh and would have been used as part of the pauper diet. Meat was probably only every few days, except there was one day of the year when they had a real treat because the Guardians provided a proper Christmas lunch for them, and I think they probably all looked forward to that throughout the year. But gruel is very much associated with workhouses, and that was, particularly for the women and the children, would have been a morning and evening event, if you like. Basically oatmeal. If you imagine your average bowl of porridge and then you chuck a whole bucket of water on it, that's about the consistency of what gruel would have been like. So not hugely appetising, but they wouldn't have starved.
Did they keep their own chickens and pigs and sheep?
The workhouse was designed to be extremely self-contained. They had relatively few staff in relation to how many paupers were in the workhouse. So you had a master and a matron, a school teacher, a visiting clerk that would come, and then later on you would have the nursing staff. But everything really was designed to be self-contained. So they had their own vegetable gardens, which the able-bodied men would look after, and the old and infirm as well. And they had pigs and they had cows.
So Sam, you are going to tell us a little bit more about the more recent history of the workhouse.
Many visitors that come to the workhouse are surprised to learn that it was still being used as a site right up until the 1980s. The workhouse system officially ended, you can either look at it in 1930 when the workhouses changed to public assistance institutions, or in 1948 obviously with the welfare state. Our site here was still being used for the care of elderly women up until the late 1980s. We had a hospital and an infirmary, which were both being used.
If, for instance, Grantham Workhouse, if it got overcrowded, would they send them here along to Southwell?
From the period of when the NHS reforms came in, we believe that women were coming to the workhouse from all over Nottinghamshire. It was through Nottinghamshire Council, so obviously Grantham would be in a separate county, so wouldn't be included. I think visitors were also surprised at the end of the tour. We have recreated a 1970s bedsit, and it's a stark contrast to what has been seen previously on the tour. We have done this because post 1950s up until the mid 1970s, 6 rooms in the house were transformed into bedsits for the use for temporary accommodation for homeless women and children.
What was the average? Was there an average length of stay if you came into the workhouse?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it very much was to do with the seasons, because this is such an rural agricultural area. Certainly for the able-bodied, there would be quite a lot of coming and going as when there was work available. The old and infirm were here, till death really.
The building was designed for 158. We know from our records that it did swell up to 210 at times. This is particularly, as Jane had said, through the winter period. You have to remember that people were free to leave the workhouse and look for work, and this was perhaps encouraged as well. But if a family came in together to the workhouse, they would have to leave together. They didn't. The Board of Guardians didn't want a situation where a man would leave his children and his wife that would just become a burden. They'd have to be paid for. They have to be paid for. And always remember that Beech's principles are to run the workhouse as a model of efficiency.
And the infirmary, were people really well cared for, as if they would have been outside of the workhouse?
The infirmary was built in 1871. This followed national guidelines that stipulated that all workhouses had to have a separate infirmary. They were absolutely paranoid about infections. Just as when you entered the workhouse, one of the first people that you would see would be the medical officer, and you would be examined. They did not want any diseases or infections coming in. So our building was built in 1871, our infirmary, and we believe that local people could actually use the infirmary as well.
Would they be deliced?
Yes, they would, yeah. And the clothes were put into disinfectant as well. They were fumigated, and as I said, their belongings were taken away from them, but they were then handed back when they left the workhouse. But what's important is that they wore the workhouse uniform, and the reasons why people were often brought back to the workhouse if they had escaped. As I said, it wasn't a prison. In theory, you could come and go. They were brought back because they were wearing the workhouse uniform, and it was the property of the workhouse.
I bought a little book which is the minutes of the guardians of the Union Workhouse in Grantham, and there's lots of references there to people being sent to the lunatic asylum.
There were people here that would suffer from, I suppose, mild mental health issues. And of course, over a period of time, there were a lot of people that were too institutionalised to leave, that, they had nowhere else to go. But I believe that there were other services within Nottingham and the Nottingham area that would look after what, they were classified as lunatics.
It was run on business principles in order to make most efficient use of resources and to provide the best possible care, as they thought at the time, for those in need from the different parishes.
Did the rates of relief that the different villages paid, were they representative of how much a person could work? If you'd got somebody elderly that really couldn't do a lot, did the parish relief pay more to the workhouse than somebody that could kind of earn a living?
I think it was just done on a per capita basis from the individual parishes. For anyone who owned property or owned land would have been a rate payer, and I think those were the funds that were.
If anybody wants to find out more about workhouse life, do you want to tell us a little bit about your opening hours and how to get here?
We are open throughout the season now until the 3rd of November. The house is open from 12 until 5 o'clock. But we do offer a welcome tour that starts at 11, where you are met by a tour guide that will take you around the outside of the house. You get to see a couple of rooms you don't normally see on the workhouse tour. We also provide services for group bookings to come in on a Monday when the house is closed. The house is actually open from Wednesday to Sunday. We're closed on a Monday and Tuesday, but as I said, we can offer group bookings as well.
You have various exhibitions and you have a few storytellers as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole programme of events, and people can find that out from the National Trust website, which is www.nationaltrust.org.uk/the Workhouse. That will detail the different events that we have, which include costumed living history events, which are always very popular. There are 3 or 4 of those running during the course of the year, and some new events for this year, such as our Twilight at the Workhouse, which links to the Museums at Night initiative. And we also have a storytelling event for Halloween this year, spooky stories. So there's something for all the family. And although people think the Workhouse is very austere and may not make for a good day out, the feedback that we get from people is that they have found it a fascinating place to visit, and even people bringing youngish children seem to find something that appeals to them all. I'd also say that not only if people are interested in visiting, but if they're interested in volunteering, the Workhouse couldn't run without its army of volunteers, and there are always opportunities in everything from gardening through to research, through to room guiding that people can get involved with.
Well, I've certainly found it fascinating. It was really good to have the audio tour, to have somebody talking to you in every room, and to go back in time.
It really does bring the Workhouse to life, the audio guide. It's through the eyes of a Victorian poor law inspector who's come to make sure that our workhouse is being run efficiently. And it really does introduce you to different characters and really does bring the property alive. Another area your listeners might be interested in is an exhibition that we're currently holding throughout the season, which is Women in the Workhouse. This focuses on oral history testimonies and provides an insight into the workhouse's more recent past.
Hi Lisa, how long have you been volunteering here at the Workhouse?
I started volunteering here in August, so a few months last season and since January this season.
What is it that attracted you to volunteer here?
Well, I'm doing a PhD in English literature, and my research is based in the 19th century, so it's quite nice to do some volunteering at the weekends. And obviously with the Workhouse being Victorian based, it was nice to work somewhere that links in with my research slightly.
When you had your first tour around the workhouse, what impression did you form?
Very cold and eerie, and the cellar spooked me out a bit, and the dead room spooked me out a bit.
What was the dead room?
The dead room is located at the back of the workhouse, and it would be where the dead bodies were taken. And immediately opposite the dead room is a refractory cell, which is where the paupers would be taken if they misbehaved. Bad language and stealing things, that sort of thing. And obviously being next to the dead room in a superstitious era, it was quite spooky for the people who were being punished.
What sort of punishments could they expect?
The most severe punishment they could be given would be maybe a day, 2 days in the refractory cell. Less severe punishments were things like not being allowed their ration of meat for a day, that sort of thing.
We get a little bit of an insight into life in the workhouse, Lisa, by looking at the rules and punishment. We've got them written on the wall here, and I believe these rules are also read out each week, so even the illiterate had no excuse for disobeying them. So every person in health shall rise by 6 o'clock in the summer and by 7 in the winter, and shall be employed in such labour as their respective age and ability will admit, and commence their work by 6 o'clock in the morning, and work till 6 o'clock at night. From Lady Day to Michaelmas, and from 7 o'clock till dark, from Michaelmas to Lady Day, allowing half an hour for breakfast and 1 hour for dinner, half an hour for supper. Anyone refusing to work shall for the first offence go without one meal, and for the next offence be reported to the overseers, that they may decide how to be punished. That all the poor in the house go to bed by 8 o'clock in the summer and by 7 o'clock in the winter, and that all candles be put out by that time. That the poor shall have their provisions in a clean and wholesome manner, their breakfast by 8, their dinner at 12, and their supper at 6 o'clock. That no waste be made, nor any provisions carried away, and that grace shall be said before and after dinner, and none may depart until grace is said. That the house be swept from top to bottom every morning, and cleaned all over once a week, or so often as the master and mistress think necessary, and that windows be opened daily. Any of the poor guilty of stealing, selling their provisions or clothing, or of drunkenness, swearing, quarrelling, fighting, or in any other way disturbing the peace of the house, or of being in any way saucy or abusive to the master or mistress, shall be punished with the utmost severity of the law. That all in the house who are able and can be spared from their duties thereof shall attend church or some other place of worship twice every Sunday, and those who refuse or neglect to attend, or do not return as soon as the service is over, shall go without their next meal, or be punished in some other way, as the overseers shall think proper. No person shall be permitted to bring spirituous liquors into the house. Those found transgressing shall lose their next meal, or be otherwise punished. Any of the poor acting in disobedience of the orders of the master or mistress, or in contempt of these orders, shall be taken before a magistrate, and punished as the law directs. If any of here are found defacing or destroying these rules, they shall be punished by being fed on bread and water only, for 2 days.
Although Grantham Workhouse no longer exists, we found records from an inspection. In February 1867, the Grantham Union Workhouse and its medical facilities were the subject of an inspection by the Poor Law Board. Extracts from the report are as follows. It is situated on the Heathful side, very near the town of Grantham, and was built soon after the passing of the Poor Law. It is constructed upon a radiating plain, with narrow rooms, lighted on both sides by windows, which open in one piece on a central pin. The ordinary sick wards are in the body of the workhouse, and consist of one for women, one for girls, and one for men, besides the lying-in ward. The general plan is that the body of the workhouse, in general, via narrow rooms with beds on either hand and a gangway down the centre. The lying-in ward is also used by imbecile women and children, but there are 2 small rooms, or, properly speaking, wooden boxes, in which the women are delivered, and in which they remain for a certain period afterwards. There is a separate two-storey building for infectious cases in the garden, within each ward, kitchen, and 2 other wards on the ground floor, and 4 sleeping rooms on the first floor. But as there are no means of separating the sexes, it is now exclusively devoted to men. At the present time, there are no infectious cases in it, and the inmates are such as required separation from the general sick. The floors are brick or plaster. There are also 3 low 1-storey buildings used for itch, syphilis, and offences cases amongst women. But some of the latter cases are retained in our ordinary wards. The general arrangements are not satisfactory, and it would be much better to build a new sick ward in which all the sick cases could be placed together, and proper infectious and separation wards should be provided for both sexes. There are water closets in several rooms on the several floors, except in the 1-storey rooms, but the windows allows the air to enter the room. There are also sinks, which with bowls are used as lavatories, but bowls and towels are taken into the sick ward. The bedsteads are of iron and without racks, and beds of straw placed upon cocoa fibre matting. The counterpanes are of cotton and are old-looking. There are armchairs, tables, and a few cupboards, night stools, bowls, books, and a few illustrated periodicals, and a clock. But there are not any prints. Mackintosh sheets and air beds have just been obtained. There are not any air cushions. 2 portable baths have recently been obtained, but there are none for the sick. The ventilation is effected by openings with shutters or large sheets of perforated zinc placed over the doors and in the gangways, and by ventilators in the ceiling covered with perforated zinc and communicating with the outer air by air bricks. In the separate buildings there is a small ventilator with a shutter over each door. In general, ventilation is defective, and in the men's ward the defect is further increased by the use of a stove which emits sulphurous odours. In no ward was the air fresh, and the boxes in the lying-in ward were really without ventilation. There is 1 paid nurse who has the charge of all the patients in the 4 separate sets of wards, amounting to 30 and to 40, and although the medical officer is regarded as the occurrer, the nurses really attends the lying-in cases. It is clear that she cannot well discharge her duties, but she generally gives each dose of stimulants, while the pauper nurse gives a dose of medicines. There is no paid night nurse. Should all the sick wards be consolidated and proper infectious and separation wards be established, she will discharge her duties more easily, but it is probable that an assistant should be appointed. The accommodation for men has lately proved inadequate, so much so that it has been found necessary to take lodgings for some aged men in the town of Grantham. I found the men's wards much overcrowded today, while the women's wards are in some instances unoccupied. There are 64 aged and infirm men in the house, and 26 aged and infirm women. Some old men sleep in wards under the walls in the yard, which must have originally been intended for workshops. These rooms are damp and have brick floors. 2 of the bedrooms intended for boys are occupied by old men. The lavatories and privies of the boys and girls are very imperfect. The lying-in ward, here called boxes, are wholly unfit for purpose. There are small closets with windows. The itch and syphilitic wards for women are unfit to be slept in. They are mere sheds. Under the boundary walls of the women's yard they are damp and have brick floors. There are detached wards for male and fever and infectious cases. These wards are used as ordinary sick wards. They are close to and partially embedded in the bank of the railway station, so all day and night the incessant noise of trains is most trying to the sick. There is 1 paid nurse, but there should be at least 2. There is a want of easy chairs, mackintosh sheets, and bed rests, and dressing gowns. There are no hot water taps in the sick wards, nor bathrooms. The guardians find cod liver oil and quinine. There is a want for amusing books for the sick and aged. Many of the bedrooms are badly ventilated.
I'm here today with Malcolm Knapp, and Malcolm's a bit of an authority on local history.
Yes.
Malcolm, there was 3 workhouses in Grantham at various different times in history. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, 3. Number 1, the first one, was at the back of Triggs Yard, which is between Watergate and Union Street. Now, we've got some dates for that, 1600s. We think that's when that was started. That was number one. It was replaced by one in Spitalgate, and they insisted on spelling it Spitalate. That was built in 1838, and it was very close to the back of the railway station. Sufficient close really for 1914, 1918 war for it to be used as a Red Cross hospital for the thousands of soldiers who were being wounded on the Western Front. The third one, which was on Dysart Road, it was built late 1800s to 1900s, and the powers that be had a lot of trouble with that one because it kept getting more and more expensive. That became, in due course, much later, the Hillview Hospital for the elderly who were either ill and not going to the Grantham Hospital, or for maternity. And both of my daughters were born in, well, if you want to be sort of a little bit difficult, just to bring them down a peg or two, tell them you were born in a workhouse.
Now, the first workhouse, Malcolm, I've had a little bit of a look on the internet, and as you say, it was believed to have stood in Triggs Yard in Watergate, but it was actually recorded that Francis Trigg bequeathed the Old Red Lion Inn in 1597 for the relief of the poor, and when it was fallen to bits it was demolished, and then a brick and stone parish workhouse replaced it on the same site. Then, as you say, we went on to the one near the railway. I have extracts from an inspection that show that some of the rooms were actually built into the embankment of the railway. And then, as you say, we move on to the Dysart Road Workhouse, which the building actually cost between £23,000 and £27,000, and there was a big 60-foot high water tower there.
Yes.
You can remember that?
Oh, very well, because eventually the family, the four of us, the wife and myself, and two daughters, we moved into Goodliff Road, and we were on the open side of Goodliff Road, looking down over the town, and of course, more or less, not exactly, but more or less, the big water tower, which was beautifully built with stone, was at the bottom of our garden. It was really good. It was beautifully built. No doubt it had to be for that amount of money to be spent on it, because that's a lot of money in those days. Lord knows how many.
Well, in 1891, yes, I imagine it would be.
How many £1 million it would be now, I dread to think. But yes, it was good. What happened to all the stone? I think the chappie who was knocking the things down, he probably rescued all the stone and used it somewhere else, because it can be used again.
Mm. The original workhouse in Triggs Yard, that's where the ATC hut is now.
Yes, yes, up that yard. That's why I'm a little bit dubious about the Red Lion being there, because my guess is that possibly, because there's only one passageway, and the chappie wouldn't want to have his pub all that far back off the main road. So what it possibly means is that from knocking down the old workhouse and getting the building materials free, he was then able to build a new pub somewhere else.
Right, okay, right.
Yeah.
Maybe need to speak to John Pinchbeck and see if he's got any clues on that.
He might have. He might have. I'll have a look in one of the earlier Grantham, bygone Granthams, because Michael Pointer did a whole survey of all the pubs in Grantham. He might have picked that up, I don't know.
These workhouses, they covered a vast area. Some of the parishes, they went into Leicestershire as well.
Yes, they were not divided up into counties. They were divided up into convenience areas. And the Grantham area, we had 51 parishes in the Grantham Out Relief Union, and 7 in Leicestershire. They were the ones that were very close to it, and it makes just one big chunk of the area, not a county, but as an area for the workhouse people to take in people who fell on hard times, or even harder times, in that area.
Some of the parishes are listed here. We've got Ancaster, Barrowby, Boothby Pagnell, Burton le Coggles, Colsterworth, North and South Witham, Welby, Wyville, Hungerton, really quite a large area.
Yes, it was very big, very big.
The workhouses, Malcolm, they were run by husband and wife.
Well, they usually had a title. It was the master and the matron. It sounded better than Fred Bloggs and his missus. Yes. What qualifications they had to be the matron or the master, I've no idea. It's never mentioned.
But the master and the matron, they wouldn't have decided who came in to the workhouse. There was a board of guardians. And you've got a fantastic little book here called the Grantham Red Book, which is a street directory and almanac and diary. We've actually got some of the guardians listed in this little book. We'll just have a look, Malcolm. Here we are. The Poor Law Union comprises 58 parishes, having 68 parochial guardians. The times of meeting every alternate Monday at 12 o'clock at the Guildhall. And the chairman was Sir Cholmondeley, and the vice-chairman Major Longstaff, and the clerk a Mr. Mallim. And then the guardians were split into different parishes. So for Grantham and Grantham Grange, which apparently is Earlsfield, we have an Arthur Hutchinson from St. Peter's Hill, and then we have a Geoffrey Smith from Barrowby Road, and the Reverend Spanton from Great Gonaby. From South Witham, who would have I had a Malcolm from South Witham? Where did you find that one?
On this page, yes.
Well, it says J. Scarborough, so we don't know if that's a Mr. or Mrs.
Oh, it would be a Mr.
It would be a Mr., would it? Oh, right, yes, of course, yes. Women were just there to cook and clean, weren't we? No. So these guardians and these parish representatives, they would sit every alternate Monday in the Guildhall and decide who was worthy of coming into the workhouse. Yes. The workhouse, it really was a last resort. It had a really bad reputation.
It was a last resort in all sorts of cases. A last resort, there's nowhere else to go to. Later on, it became far more civilised and became the Hillview Hospital, the Dysart Road one. That was for the elderly who were either very ill and couldn't go to Grantham Hospital, which was there on Manthorpe Road, or, as my two daughters will tell you, they were born in the old workhouse, which wasn't really the workhouse, to be honest, because that was further down the lane, underneath the big arches, which were very impressive, very imposing, on Dysart Road.
You've got a little note here about not making the place too comfortable.
Yes, I've had a look this morning and found some bits and bobs. And there's a piece whereby one of the, not Grantham particularly, but elsewhere, the people who had to pay for these people being put into the workhouse, and they hated that because it cost more to the council, and the builder was told by the organiser, don't make the workhouse too comfortable, otherwise they would probably want to come back. And that was not what they wanted.
Malcolm, can you tell me what kind of work the paupers would have done in the workhouse?
Yes, there's a picture in one of my books of a whole room actually full of poor old men sitting down, but breaking big stones into little stones for roadworks. And there's, in the picture, I haven't counted them, but there must be 50 or 60 old men sit down with a pile of stones in front of them, which I think were the big ones, which they had to break into little ones so that people could, I won't say tarmac because it hadn't been invented then, but they could put stone on the roads or the lanes or whatever and make them a little bit better. They were doing something, and they probably got paid a penny a day. And food, and coming on to food, I can remember as a boy, or a young man going to work, walking down Dysart Road to go to the bus station to catch the bus to go out to work. And in some of the gardens, the back gardens or front gardens, I'd see a big chunk of bread and a big chunk of cheese. And I thought, well, where's all that come from? And eventually I found out that when the people were kicked out of the workhouse to go out to work somewhere, they were given rations, a big piece of bread, which was God knows how old, and a big chunk of cheese, which was to last them all day. But when a lady asked them why have you thrown yours away? The answer was, because we can get something better from somewhere else.
One of the other trades, I believe, in the workhouse was taking the rope to pieces to get it back to a fibre state.
Picking oakum, yes, that was done for all sorts of different reasons, because rope was vital in the Victorian era and beforehand for boats and ships. They were all wood and rope, and that's what's needed.
Certainly at Southwell I saw examples of the ladies doing this.
Well, they may have more nimble fingers before they dropped off, yes.
Well, absolutely, they must have got so very sore doing that. So the workhouse was the last resort. It must have been almost on par with being in prison at that time.
Some cases, there's a piece in that book where someone has quoted saying that the prison was better than the workhouse, yeah.
If you were in a workhouse and you died in the workhouse, apparently they put you in the dead room.
Yes.
I've heard examples of the local coalmen coming to fetch the body.
Very likely. It didn't matter, did it? They wouldn't know.
They would have ended up in a pauper's grave, wouldn't they, from the workhouse?
Yes. There's possibly no record of them. Certainly not now.
When I was listening to the stories from Southwell Workhouse, I presume that they were very similar to any other workhouse. That was really, the workhouse really was the start of the social reform, wasn't it?
Yes, because until then, this is the thing that most people tend to forget, that before the workhouse came in, which was not very good, to put it mildly, there was nothing before. You died if you had a daughter or a son, you lodged with him if he'd have you, and if not, you were thrown out onto the road and you died in the hedge bottom. There was
no old age pension.
No.
As you got old and you couldn't work, you were really reliant on your family.
Old age pension didn't come in until about 1905.
It wasn't just the elderly though, was it? It was farm workers when out of season that needed a bit of help, those that were in tied houses.
Well, what about this last week we just had, or this fortnight we just had, these cold easterly winds? Well, there's more people died in the last couple of weeks than previously had because of the cold wind and trying to keep warm. We've only lived in one room.
We've got it made really, haven't we, today?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
People don't realise that because they don't know anything at all about this. Charles Dickens was the first one to start saying these things about the workhouse.
Well, that's right. We think of Oliver Twist, don't we, when we think of the workhouse?
Yes.
Yeah. But the children at least would have been schooled, which was...
Of a sort. That was probably worse than the workhouse. Some of the teachers were, from what we read, very vicious.
Really?
Yeah. And there's no... You could sort of virtually half kill a child, and there's nothing to say you couldn't. No, it's if you got a kind, good teacher, you were very lucky. Times have changed.
But for a young lady, if she was widowed...
And children...
with children, she wouldn't really be able to work and support herself. So she would have automatically
But she had to, because otherwise they didn't get anything to eat. She would be doing some needlework or something, or knitting or whatever. Something that she could do, and the children could do as well, from about the age of about 3 or 4 onwards. I mean, there are all sorts of pictures and stories of boys of 6 and 7 going working down the mine.
The children that were schooled, they would have tried to get them into work. I presume that the girls would have gone into domestic service, maybe the boys into the forces, into the army.
If the army wanted them. The army, or the forces or services, they cost money. And that's the sort of thing that the powers that be don't like to part with. So they didn't have an army of any sort until they actually needed one. And by then, of course, it was getting a bit late. But it's all of it, all the way through it's a question of money. Lack of it, or people not wanting to part with it. That's all the way through.
The money for the poorhouses came from rates, from the wealthy
Yes,
ratepayers,
yes.
the landowners.
Yes, yes, the farmers in their nice green fields and nice crops, etc. Yes, they'd pay the workers sort of a penny a day or twopence a day, whatever, and they'd have to contribute to the running of the workhouse once they came in, and they didn't like doing that.
What I did find very sad, Malcolm, was the segregation, that the mothers were not allowed to be with their children, were not allowed to be with their husbands.
The worst one I ever read, and I can't remember where I read it, but I can remember it. There was a couple, they lived in the tied house. Now that was the curse of mankind, the tied house, because it means when you were farming, you were all right doing the work for the farmer in his tied house. But when you were then 65, 70 and decrepit, you couldn't work, so you got out. Anywhere. Got out. There was a couple in some village. They were both in their 80s. They had never been parted from each other since the day they got married. They had to go into a workhouse because there was nowhere else for them to go. The wife went up the driveway and went to the left. The man went up the driveway to the right. First time in about 50, 60 years they'd been parted. And they died within a week.
Why do you think the workhouses had to separate husbands and wives?
Because it was easiest. You could have them all together. Whereas if you have a husband and wife there, and a husband and wife there, they take up too much room. You can get more in. You don't have to petition them.
So it was just a business decision,
Of
really?
course it was.
Yeah.
It's all business. Once you start dealing with money, it's business. No matter what it is, it's money. They never had enough because the folks wouldn't part with it, and they never have enough now.
This month's Heritage feature was brought to you by Gravity FM with thanks to Helen Anderson, Malcolm Knapp and the staff of Southwell Workhouse.